Well, glad you're here today with us. If you are visiting, so you know what we are doing on Sunday mornings, we started in January, working our way through Genesis, which is the first book in the Bible. It's a book that really tells us about the origins of our world, of mankind. It explains to us how we have ended up today in the situations we are in as sin entered into the world and mankind has been in a rebellion against its creator for generation after generation. At the same time, the reason we have been going through Genesis is because Genesis also shows us over and over the character of God. That he is a God that is a creator. He is a God who is omnipotent. He is all powerful. He is omniscient, meaning he is all knowing. He is eternal. He was before creation, and after time is gone, he will still exist. But he is also a God who is holy, righteous, and a judge, but a holy, righteous judge who is completely loving, merciful, and gracious, which is absolutely incredible. As we've read these stories, we have seen person after person, family after family, who is really messed up. By today's standards and by anybody's standards, these people have really messed up time and time again. And yet it is God who fulfills his promises to be with them. It is God who calls them to himself. And family after family, person after person, we've seen throughout their life how God moves and they turn and they begin to follow him. That's why I love the book of Genesis. There's all kinds of great factual things, great mysterious things, but the biggest thing that I love about the book of Genesis is watching God move in such a way where people experience his grace and come to him and are changed. Absolutely incredible. As we get to Genesis 40 today, we're in a place where we're reading the story of Joseph. And Joseph was a young man that God was blessing in many ways. His older brothers became jealous of him and sold him into slavery. And to make an incredibly long story short, some of you are like, right now, is he really going to make it short? That would be a miracle today. Yes. Joseph is in prison. Genesis 40, starting at verse 1, we read this. Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. That's Pharaoh. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody. We have this image a lot of times, and it's hard to know, is he in a dungeon? Is he in a pit, a cistern? And the answer is sort of yes, but at the same time, notice that he is in the house of the captain of the guard. So most likely it is somewhat of a house arrest where there is some type of prison cells, but it is also a large house that he is in. And we're going to find he has some degree of freedom while he's here and has been given a place of honor. Verse 5, and one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, why are your faces downcast today? And they said to him, we have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them. And Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me. Just a quick note on this. As we've read earlier in Joseph's life, he was a young man who was given two different prophetic dreams from the Lord. The Lord didn't speak to him directly with his great-grandfather, Abraham. God spoke to him directly. We saw that when it came to Jacob, God spoke to Jacob sometimes directly and other times through visions. But so far, what we've seen with Joseph is God hasn't spoken to him directly. He hasn't spoken to him through visions, but two times he dreamt, and God spoke to him through those dreams. Now, this is a step further for Joseph when it comes to this interaction. He is not saying, I have dreamed something and I'll tell you what the dreams mean. This is a step way further. He's saying, you've had bad dreams, both of you. Tell me what they are, and God is going to interpret them for you. Huge step of boldness and faith on the part of Joseph. Verse 9. So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, in my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Then Joseph said to him, this is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office. And you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formally as when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me when it is well with you. And please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews. And here also I have done nothing that they should put me in the pit. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and the uppermost basket, there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the baskets on my head. That is a creepy dream. And Joseph answered and said, this is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you. Yeah, you look at this, and there's a few things going on here. One, we find both later in the Old Testament and in different Assyrian writings from the same time period, the phrase to lift one's head up was a legal term that meant you were being released. You're being released. Your head is now being lifted up. And you can think of it this way: while they were in prison, put there by Pharaoh, their heads were downcast. It was a place of guilt, of shame, but the king had the authority to release them from that. And so on the day that they were released, the term was they could now lift their head, stand upright once again. So you get the cupbearer. What incredible news! What incredible news to find out that even though you are here in this prison, in just 3 days, you're going to be not only released, your head will be lifted up, and you get to return to the place of honor, the cupbearer for the king. Some translations say butler, and that's a horrible translation, because instantly for people in this room, it makes you think of Alfred. That's not what we're talking about here. The cupbearer was a person who stood next to the king, tasted all of his wine, tasted all of his food. So it was a mixture between a servant who was there for him, but also the closest person on your Secret Service team. Right there, always with you, protecting you. And inevitably what you found, because that person was always at the right hand of the king, they had influence that was so much greater than your average person. Great news. But this play on words here, the baker hears that interpretation and thinks, cool. My dream was a dream about threes as well. So if that's the dream that he got, I want this great interpretation, right? It's sort of like when you go and you get a fortune cookie and somebody else opens theirs and it's really cool. And you're like, I want to look at my fortune cookie now. Anyone else like that? Yeah, a few people here. You look at it, but his dream, oh my goodness, you too, your head is going to be lifted up right off the rest of your body. And the term there for him being hung on a tree can also be interpreted impaled on a tree. Impaled on the tree. And one of the practices in Egypt was when they would kill somebody under the law was to behead them and then place the body on a stake for all to see. Complete dishonor. Verse 20, the story goes on and says, on the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all of his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, and Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. You look at this, and you have the story of this man. When we first read about him, he's a teenager who is having prophetic dreams. Now, what we're about to read, we find out he's now in his 30s, and he is interpreting these dreams. How do we know that he is doing this by the power and influence of God? Because they come true. 100% accuracy, and they come true. Joseph is operating in a way that later he would be called a prophet, and as you go through the Old Testament, you see that there are prophets talked about in the different books of the Bible, some of those books written by prophets. How do you know that a prophet is truly from God and speaking the words of God? Because when they're prophesying, whether it's through visions, dreams, or other things that we see in the Bible, it comes true. It comes true. And within the law that the Hebrews followed, if somebody claimed to be a prophet of God and what they said did not come true, there was capital punishment for that. Why do I bring that out right now? Because I will say that there is nothing in the Bible that says that God cannot today function the same way in the lives of his people, speaking to people through dreams or visions. I know some of you have been under the tutelage. That's a funny word. That's why I like to say it, tutelage. Some of you have been under the tutelage of other pastors who will say, oh yeah, God doesn't do that today. God only speaks through his word, through the Bible. And yet you would never come up with that interpretation if you just read the Bible. That's something that people have to come through to take things out of context, breaking their own rules of interpretation in order to get to it. Do people today have dreams and visions that come from the Lord? Oh, yes. Oh, yes. In fact, the whole reason I'm in ministry today is because of a dream that I had. My father was a pastor. My grandfather was a pastor. The last thing I ever wanted to be was a lawyer. Just kidding. A pastor. A pastor, right? I only tell that joke when Jim's here. I didn't want to be a pastor. I wanted to be either a detective or a counselor, one of the two. And I wanted to help people in those capacities. But it was because of a dream that the Lord gave me that one day I told my wife, by the way, I'm called into ministry. And she was like, what? Because that was nowhere on my radar. You're like, well, that's just a personal thing. I mean, are you sure it wasn't the broccoli you had the night before or something? Yes, I am sure. And even today, I don't know if you realize this, you can look this up. Look up Iran, Pakistan. Did you know that today in Iran and Pakistan, there are all kinds of people coming to Christ? Why? Because all kinds of people are having dreams and visions of a man in white that is calling them to himself. There are literally ads and billboards being put out in those countries by Christians saying, hey, if you've had a dream with a man who looked like this, call this number. And it's literally Christ showing himself to people, just like he did to Paul on the road to Emmaus. There's like revival happening there in those countries. You're like, well, why don't we hear about it? Because the church is underground in those countries. They don't get to put it on social media like we do. They don't get to do the same kinds of things we do. They have to be more quiet about it. But it leaks out. But there's a warning on that. Here's my caveat. Does God move that way, and can he move that way today? Yes. But there are a lot of hucksters out there. There are a lot of people that say those kinds of things and do those kinds of things in ways to manipulate you, to get money from you for their own ego, for their own power, and things like that. Be careful. Is what they say true 100% of the time? And there are a lot of famous names out there that if you came and asked me, we could look on the internet that quick and find out, no, they're false prophets. They are false prophets. So be careful. Handle it with fear and trembling with these kinds of things. And as we go further in the story, I'm going to show you from Joseph some things to watch for with this kind of spiritual gift. Verse 1 of chapter 41, we read this. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile, and behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came out of the Nile after them, and stood by the cows on the bank of the Nile, and the ugly cows, the thin cows, ate up the 7 attractive, plump cows. And Pharaoh awoke, and he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on a stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump, full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So in the morning, his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today, when Pharaoh was angry with his servant and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. We dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Love verse 16 here. Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. It is not me. God will do it. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, behold, in my dream I was standing in the banks of the Nile. 7 cows, plump and attractive, came out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and thin, such as I had never seen in the land of Egypt. And the thin, ugly cows ate up the first 7 plump cows. But when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were still as ugly as at the beginning. Then I awoke. I also saw in my dream 7 ears growing on one stalk, full and good. 7 ears, withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind, sprouted after them, and the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. And I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh that what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears, blighted by the east wind, are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them, there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be known in the land by reason of the famine that will follow, for it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. Wow. You look at this, and we've been talking about dreams, how the Lord speaks. But please note there is our first difference in Joseph from when he had dreams as a teenager. Are you noticing his humility? You noticing his humility? He's not saying, I'm going to give you this interpretation. Look at me and the gifts I have. For Joseph, it is not about him. It is about God. It's about God. Brothers and sisters, we have people in the church today, I'm not saying in our church, but in the church as a whole, that claim to be these spiritual people, that claim to have God moving in their life in these different things, but they lack maturity enough to be humble. And if you listen, it's not about Christ. It's about them. One of the key signs of someone who is spiritually matured, someone who is truly spirit-filled, there will be a humility that comes along with it. And they will never be the person saying, look at me, come buy tickets from me. It will be quiet and in the background, and they will operate with fear and with trembling, with faith, but with a humility recognizing this is not about me. I am nothing special. This is solely about Christ. Verse 33, now therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man. Notice he's not saying himself. And set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through famine. Did you notice the second sign of Joseph's maturity, his spiritual maturity, his truly being filled with the Spirit? First, he's humble. But notice, Pharaoh didn't ask for advice, but Joseph gave it. And his advice is filled with wisdom and discernment. Wisdom and discernment. Look at that advice that just comes there. It's like, wow, that makes sense. As the Lord is giving him these interpretations, suddenly there is also a wisdom that is coming out of Joseph. You cannot be a spiritually mature person, a spirit-filled person, without wisdom. Without wisdom. There's a reason why when you go to the book of Acts and the disciples needed help in ministry, they looked at the church, over 5,000 people in the church at that time, and said, we need help. Choose 7 men, and they gave qualifications for the men that were to help the apostles. What were the qualifications? That they be filled with the Holy Spirit and wisdom. And wisdom. I love this. This is how you know when God is truly moving on somebody. There is a humility that comes with it, and a wisdom that is beyond somebody's experience and reason that comes out at the same time. Let's finish out the story really quick. Verse 37. This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants, and Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all of this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand and clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. And he made him ride in his second chariot. And they called out before him, bow the knee. Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphenath-Paneah, and he gave him in marriage to Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, the priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly. And he gathered up all the food of these 7 years, which occurred in the land of Egypt, and put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. Before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, For, Joseph said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. The name of the second he called Ephraim. For God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. The 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the land, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Joseph for bread. Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. What he says to you, do it." So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt, to Joseph, to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the land. This is a powerful story when you look at and you see the story of how God takes a man who is at the lowest point of his life, and yet God fulfills his promises to Joseph in his perfect timing. In his perfect timing. We see a story of a man who was 17 and was arrogant and prideful, and his arrogance and pride got him in trouble. But now we see a man who is 30 years old, who is spiritually mature, who has wisdom, discernment, and humility. And as verse 38 says, can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God? Man, I absolutely love the story of Joseph. It's powerful in the way it reads. It's a reason why it has been turned into movies, miniseries, books, Broadway plays. It reads a lot like the story of Daniel, if you will, as well. But brothers and sisters, here's the good news for today. That same Spirit that was on Joseph is yours today if you are a believer in Christ. The same Spirit, God working and moving in you and through you, and in His time bringing His plans to fruition. This whole story just makes me think of both what the prophet Joel said and what Peter repeated on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. Let me read it. Acts 2, starting at verse 17, Peter says this to the crowds of people. In the last days it shall be, God declares, that I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh. Stop for a second and think about this. This is the Spirit of God. God Himself being poured out like it was poured out on Joseph, Moses, Joshua, Samson, Samuel, David, Isaiah, Jeremiah. Should I keep going? This is God's Spirit being poured out. And in the Old Testament, it was only for prophets, priests, and kings. But now, in the day we live, the Bible says that the Spirit will be poured out on all flesh. And now watch, he's going to explain what he means by all flesh. On your sons and daughters, and your sons and daughters shall prophesy. That means young people. Your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. Does it matter how old you are? No. All means all. On every male servant and female servant. What does that mean? Does it matter if you are a man or woman? No. And notice the term servant. Economic status does not matter. You could be at what the world considers the bottom of the heap. It does not matter. Even on male servant and female servants, in those days I shall pour out my spirit, and they shall prophesy, and I will show wonders in heavens above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire, vapor of smoke. The sun shall be turned to darkness, the moon to blood, before the day of the Lord comes, the great and magnificent day. And why? Why does God do this? Why does he want to do this in me? Why does he want to move by his Holy Spirit in you? The last verse of this little prophecy. And it shall come to pass that everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. This kind of spirituality has nothing to do about our own gain. It is all about Christ and what he wants to do in his kingdom. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be praised. Any of you heard the news over the last couple weeks about someone named Kat Von D? All right, a few of us. Kat Von D, famous tattoo artist. She had her own reality shows. Kat Von D, famous occultist. She had her own line of tarot cards. Severely in the occult. One of her best friends was Marilyn Manson. And some of you are like, who are these people? Just trust me. They're not the people we're going to see at church typically on Sunday. A year ago, Kat Von D announced on her social media that she was giving up the occult. And 2 weeks ago, she invited all kinds of her friends that are Satanists and occultists and into witchcraft to a little church in the country where she's been attending for the last year. And she stood up there in the choir. It's a choir full of sorry for some of this, old people. And she's right there on the edge, and there's Kat Von D. And her arms were mostly blacked out because she was covered in witchcraft and occult tattoos. And she just blacked them out. And she sang that day in the choir, and later was baptized. All who call upon the name of the Lord will be saved. Brothers and sisters, you can never be good enough to be saved. It's not about how good you are. It's about the fact that he loves you. He loves the people around you. And everything we do here, it's not about us. It's about the next one he wants to save and call into his family.